The morning of June 13th, 1944, London. A sound unlike anything the city had endured during 4 years of war cut through the pre-dawn darkness. Not the familiar drone of Luftwaffe bombers or the whistling descent of high-explosive bombs, but something mechanical and relentless. A pulse jet engine stuttering across the sky at 350 miles per hour, carrying 1 ton of Amatol explosive toward the city centre. The V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe, his vengeance weapon, had arrived. Within 90 seconds of crossing the English coast, the weapon's crude autopilot would cut the engine. Silence, then impact. In the rubble of a Bethnal Green tenement, rescue workers pulled 17 bodies from the wreckage. 8 of them are children. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The British War Cabinet convened an emergency session at Storey's Gate that afternoon. Winston Churchill studied reconnaissance photographs showing launch sites scattered across the Pas de Calais, concrete ramps pointed like accusing fingers toward London. Intelligence estimates suggested the Germans possessed enough Von Second to maintain attacks for months, perhaps years. Traditional air defences were failing catastrophically. RAF fighters struggled to intercept the small, fast-moving targets. Anti-aircraft guns firing conventional ammunition achieved hit rates below 3%, but in wooden crates stacked in the cargo holds of ships crossing the Atlantic, a solution was already en route to Britain. Proximity fuzzes. The revolutionary ammunition that had transformed American naval warfare in the Pacific were about to face their greatest test. Could artillery shells that thought for themselves stop Hitler's robot bombs before they destroyed London's will to continue the war? The V-1 offensive began with methodical German precision on June 13th, 1944, exactly 1 week after Allied forces had established beachheads in Normandy. The timing was deliberate. Hitler's military planners believed that sustained attacks against London would force Britain to divert resources from supporting the invasion, potentially allowing German forces to drive the Allies back into the sea. The Fieseler V-103, designated V-1 by German propaganda ministry, represented a revolutionary approach to strategic bombing. Unlike conventional aircraft requiring trained pilots and sophisticated navigation equipment, the flying bomb was essentially a cruise missile avant la lettre. An Argus pulse jet engine mounted above a simple fuselage propelled the weapon at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. A mechanical autopilot maintained altitude and heading using a magnetic compass and barometric pressure sensors. A small propeller in the nose counted down the distance traveled. When the predetermined range was reached, the fuel supply shut off, the engine stopped, and the weapon dove toward whatever lay beneath. The simplicity was both elegant and terrifying. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, roughly the equivalent of a small automobile. A single Junkers Ju-88 bomber cost 40 times that amount and required a crew of 4 trained airmen who took years to replace if lost. The V-1 could be assembled by semi-skilled labourers in factories immune to British bombing, because they were scattered across occupied France and hidden in converted mine shafts throughout Germany. Production had reached 250 units per week by early June, with plans to increase output to 1,000 per week by autumn. The psychological impact of the V-1 attacks exceeded even their substantial material damage. Unlike conventional bombing raids that arrived with air raid warnings and the sound of aircraft engines giving some advance notice, the flying bombs struck with almost no warning. The pulse jet's distinctive buzzing sound, which Londoners quickly learned to dread, provided perhaps 30 seconds of notice before impact. Then came the silence as the engine cut out, followed by the explosion. The randomness was psychologically devastating. A V-1 launched from Pas de Calais might impact anywhere within a 10-mile radius of central London depending on wind conditions, fuel load variations, and minor differences in launch trajectory. No neighbourhood was safe. No pattern could be discerned. The weapons fell on hospitals and schools, factories and residential streets, with democratic impartiality that made traditional civil defence planning nearly impossible. British casualty statistics from the first week of V-1 attacks revealed the scale of the crisis. 244 flying bombs had crossed the English coast. 73 had been destroyed by fighter aircraft or anti-aircraft fire. 144 had reached the London metropolitan area. The weapons had killed 476 civilians, seriously injured over 1,400, and rendered thousands homeless. If the Germans maintained this rate of fire, London would suffer casualties equivalent to the entire 1940 Blitz within 3 months. Air Marshal Roderick Hill, commanding air defence of Great Britain, faced a defensive problem that seemed to violate every principle of conventional military planning. His forces were organised to defeat bomber formations that approached at predictable altitudes and speeds, giving radar operators and fighter controllers time to coordinate interception. The V-1 flew too fast for most fighter aircraft to catch, too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns to engage effectively, and too small to reliably detect on radar until it was nearly over its target. Hill's initial defensive response reflected the limited options available to British forces in mid-June 1944. Fighter squadrons equipped with the latest Hawker, Tempest and Gloucester Meteor aircraft patrolled the coast, attempting to intercept Vone's 2nd before they reached the built-up areas around London. The pilots faced extraordinary challenges. A Vone-inch-level flight could outrun most fighters except for the newest models. Shooting one down required closing to within 300 yards and maintaining that position long enough to pour cannon fire into the weapon's small fuselage. Many pilots discovered that the V-1's 1-ton warhead could destroy the attacking fighter if detonated too close. Squadron leader Joseph Berry, flying a Tempest with 609 Squadron, developed a technique of tipping the V-1's wing with his own wingtip, disrupting the gyroscopic autopilot and sending the weapon into an uncontrolled dive over unpopulated areas. The maneuver required extraordinary skill and nerves. Berry would position his fighter alongside the flying bomb at 400 miles per hour, matching speed and altitude precisely, then edge his wingtip under the V-1's wing and roll sharply. The sudden change in airflow would tumble the weapon's guidance system, usually sending it spiraling into the English Channel or open countryside. Other pilots attempted similar techniques with varying success and occasional fatal consequences when they misjudged distances or encountered Vone's 2nd with unstable flight characteristics. Anti-aircraft defences proved even less effective than fighter interception during the first weeks of the V-1 offensive. British gun batteries surrounding London were equipped with conventional mechanical time fuzzes that required gunners to estimate the precise moment when their shell would reach the target's altitude. Against manned aircraft following evasive flight paths, this technique achieved hit rates around 5% under ideal conditions. Against Vone's 2nd, flying straight and level at constant speed, accuracy should have improved dramatically. The reality was brutally different. Vone's 2nd approached at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet, well within the engagement range of British 3.7-inch and 4.5-inch anti-aircraft guns. But the weapons flew at speeds that human gunners found nearly impossible to track accurately. The small size of the V-1's fuselage, approximately 25 feet long with a 17-foot wingspan, presented a minimal target compared to conventional bombers. Gun crews firing mechanical time fuses needed to calculate not just the V-1's current position, but where it would be 3 to 4 seconds in the future when their shell reached detonation altitude. Miss that calculation by 0.3 of a second, and 50 pounds sterling worth of ammunition exploded uselessly in empty air, while the flying bomb continued toward London unharmed. The statistics from the first 2 weeks of anti-aircraft operations against Vone's 2nd revealed the scale of the defensive failure. British gun batteries had fired over 20,000 rounds of conventional ammunition and achieved fewer than 200 confirmed kills. Each destroyed V-1 required an average of 100 rounds, costing approximately £5,000 total. The Germans could manufacture a replacement flying bomb for that same amount. The economic mathematics were unsustainable. If this exchange ratio continued, British ammunition production would be overwhelmed within weeks, while German V-1 factories continued churning out weapons faster than they could be destroyed. Churchill understood that conventional defences were failing to stop Hitler's vengeance weapons. During a tense cabinet meeting on June 27th, he demanded solutions that actually worked rather than reassuring reports about improved fighter tactics and better anti-aircraft coordination. The Prime Minister had received intelligence estimates suggesting the Germans planned to increase V-1 production substantially, potentially launching 1,000 per week by autumn. At that rate of fire, sustained over months, London's civilian population might face casualties exceeding the entire 1941 Blitz. The political consequences could be catastrophic, undermining British support for continuing the war just as Allied forces were gaining momentum in France. General Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, understood that he needed weapons capable of destroying Von II reliably and efficiently. His conventional ammunition was demonstrably inadequate for the task, but American proximity fuses, the revolutionary radar-equipped shells that had transformed Pacific naval warfare, offered possibilities that might finally give British defences an effective counter to Hitler's robot bombs. The question was whether shells designed to destroy aircraft over open water could function against flying bombs over the densely populated landscape of southern England. The proximity fuse had been developed specifically for American naval warfare, with operational constraints that reflected the unique requirements of shipboard anti-aircraft defense. The fuses could only be used over water, where undetonated shells would sink harmlessly, rather than potentially falling into enemy hands for reverse engineering. This restriction had been absolute throughout Pacific operations. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, had threatened court-martial for any commander who authorized proximity fuse use over land where enemy forces might recover the technology. But June 1944 presented circumstances that overrode previous security concerns. The Allied invasion of Normandy was succeeding. German forces were retreating across France with substantial equipment losses that increasingly included radar installations and electronic warfare systems. The risk that Germany could reverse engineer American proximity fuses and develop countermeasures seemed less critical than the immediate threat to London from sustained V-1 attacks. The decision to authorize proximity fuse use over Britain came from the combined Chiefs of Staff after consultation with President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. The potential benefits to British civilian morale and the practical necessity of stopping the V-1 offensive outweighed the theoretical security risks. American proximity fuse production had reached over 400,000 units per month by mid-1944. Diverting a portion of that output to British anti-aircraft defences would not compromise American naval operations in the Pacific. The first shipment of proximity fuses arrived at British ports during the last week of June, packed in wooden crates marked only with cryptic supply codes that revealed nothing about their revolutionary contents. Each fuse contained 5 miniature vacuum tubes, precision timing circuits, a spring-powered generator, and a radio transmitter capable of detecting flying bombs at ranges up to 70 feet. The electronic complexity exceeded most commercial radios of the era, all packaged in a device smaller than a soup can and designed to survive being fired from a cannon. General Pyle reviewed the American technical documentation describing proximity fuse operation with the skepticism of a career artillery officer who had witnessed numerous technological promises fail under combat conditions. The fuses supposedly required no range estimation by gun crews. The shells would fly toward their targets and detonate automatically when they passed within lethal range of a flying bomb. The concept seemed almost magical, transforming anti-aircraft fire from a game of precise calculation into near-certain destruction for any V-1 that came within range. The operational trial began on June 28 along the coast of Kent, where British gun batteries had been repositioned to intercept V-2 before they reached densely populated areas. Battery commanders received sealed orders emphasizing absolute secrecy about the new ammunition. Gun crews were told only that they were testing experimental shells that would improve accuracy against flying bombs. The technical principles underlying proximity fuse operation were classified at levels that prevented most soldiers from learning how the weapons actually functioned. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison commanded the 1st Battery to fire proximity-fused ammunition in combat against V-1 targets. His 3.7-inch guns were positioned near Dymchurch, with overlapping fields of fire covering the likely approach routes for flying bombs launched from Pas-de-Calais. The battery had expended over 1,500 rounds of conventional ammunition during the previous 2 weeks, achieving 12 confirmed V-1 kills. Harrison's gunners were experienced, well-trained, and increasingly demoralized by their inability to effectively defend against weapons they could see and hear but rarely destroy. The first V-1 detection came at 08:15 hours on June 28. Radar operators identified the characteristic signature of a flying bomb crossing the French coast at low altitude, heading northwest toward the English Channel. Harrison's battery began tracking the target, calculating intercept coordinates, while the V-1 approached at its steady 350 miles per hour. At a range of 4,000 yards, the order to fire echoed across the battery position. The first proximity-fused shell left the gun barrel with the same familiar report that Harrison's crews had heard thousands of times before. But what happened next violated every principle of conventional anti-aircraft gunnery. The shell didn't wait for a predetermined time to detonate. Instead, its miniature radar transmitter activated during flight, broadcasting radio waves that reflected off the approaching V-1. When the return signal indicated the flying bomb had entered lethal range, the fuse triggered instantaneously. The explosion occurred 70 feet from the V-1's fuselage, exactly as American engineers had designed. Shrapnel traveling at thousands of feet per second shredded the thin aluminum skin of the flying bomb's pulse jet engine. The weapon's fuel system ruptured. Fire erupted along the length of the fuselage. The V-1 tumbled from the sky and impacted in an unpopulated marsh 3 miles short of its intended target, its 1-ton warhead detonating harmlessly in soft mud. Harrison's gunners stared at the pillar of smoke rising from the crash site with expressions mixing disbelief and elation. They had fired 1 round. The V-1 was destroyed. In 2 weeks of operations using conventional ammunition, achieving a single kill had required an average of 137 rounds. The improvement was so dramatic it seemed impossible. The second V-1 appeared on radar screens 40 minutes later. Harrison's battery engaged with 3 proximity-fused shells. The first detonated slightly beyond optimal range, causing minor damage to the flying bomb's control surfaces. The second shell exploded directly beneath the weapon, destroying it so completely that wreckage scattered across a 2-mile radius. The third shell never fired. It wasn't needed. By the end of that first day of operations, Harrison's battery had engaged 17 V-2 using proximity-fused ammunition. 14 were destroyed before reaching the British coast. 2 sustained damage that sent them crashing into the Channel. 1 evaded the defensive fire through what appeared to be a malfunction in its autopilot that sent it climbing far above the gun's maximum engagement altitude. The hit rate exceeded 80%, a 6-fold improvement over conventional ammunition that transformed the fundamental mathematics of V-1 defense. General Pyle received Harrison's initial combat report with carefully controlled optimism, born from decades of military experience that taught him to distrust preliminary success statistics. But subsequent reports from additional batteries equipped with proximity fuzzes confirmed the pattern. British anti-aircraft defences had finally found a weapon capable of stopping Hitler's vengeance weapons before they reached London. The transformation of British anti-aircraft effectiveness against V-1 attacks accelerated rapidly during July 1944 as more gun batteries received proximity-fused ammunition. General Pyle reorganized his entire defensive system, creating what became known as the diver strip, a concentrated belt of anti-aircraft guns positioned along the coast between Dover and Beachy Head. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Stop the flying bombs over water or unpopulated countryside before they reached the London metropolitan area. The diver strip represented the largest concentration of anti-aircraft firepower ever assembled for defense of a single target. 492 heavy anti-aircraft guns, primarily 3.7-inch and 4.5-inch weapons, were positioned in carefully planned defensive positions that created overlapping fields of fire. Each gun was supported by radar tracking equipment, power generators, and ammunition stocks that included thousands of proximity-fused shells. The defensive doctrine developed for engaging Zone 2 with proximity fuses differed fundamentally from conventional anti-aircraft tactics. Gun crews no longer needed to calculate precise range estimates or time fuse settings. The radar-equipped shells would handle targeting automatically once they approached within lethal range. Gunners focused instead on volume of fire, bracketing the flying bomb's flight path with multiple shells to ensure at least one would pass close enough to trigger its proximity fuse. Squadron leader Edward Crewe watched the transformation of anti-aircraft effectiveness from his fighter cockpit as he patrolled above the diver strip during early July operations. Below, gun batteries were engaging, Zone 2 with sustained barrages that created walls of exploding shells through which few flying bombs could pass unharmed. The sky above the Kent countryside, filled with white smoke bursts marking proximity, fuse detonations, each one potentially destroying a weapon that would have killed dozens of London civilians. The statistics compiled by Air Defence of Great Britain revealed the dramatic impact of proximity fuzzes on V-1 interception rates. During the first week of July, gun batteries equipped with conventional ammunition achieved 12% hit rates against flying bombs. Batteries firing proximity-fused shells destroyed 74% of Zone 2 that entered their engagement zones. The improvement was so substantial that it altered the fundamental balance between offensive and defensive capabilities in ways that German planners had not anticipated. German intelligence officers analyzing the sudden increase in V-1 losses correctly deduced that British anti-aircraft defences had been substantially upgraded, but failed to identify the specific technology responsible. Reconnaissance aircraft photographing British gun positions showed no obvious changes in equipment or deployment patterns. The guns remained the same 3.7-inch and 4.5-inch weapons that had been firing conventional ammunition for weeks. What the Germans could not see was the revolutionary electronics packed inside the nose of each shell. The operational tempo of the V-1 campaign reached its peak during mid-July 1944, as German launch crews maximised their firing rates in hopes of overwhelming British defences through sheer numbers. On July 16th, German forces launched 104 flying bombs toward London during a single 24-hour period. It represented the most intense day of V-1 attacks since the campaign began. The diver strip batteries engaged every incoming weapon with proximity-fused ammunition. Of the 104 Zone 2 launched, 68 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire before reaching the coast. Another 23 were shot down by fighter aircraft patrolling beyond the gun belt. 11 sustained damage that sent them crashing into unpopulated areas. Only 2 flying bombs reached the London metropolitan area, where they killed 4 civilians and damaged residential properties. The exchange ratio had reversed completely from the early days of the V-1 offensive. German forces were now expending enormous resources to launch weapons that British defences destroyed with near-certain effectiveness. Each V-1 required fuel, launch equipment, maintenance crews, and transportation infrastructure. Each proximity-fused shell cost approximately $18 and achieved destruction rates exceeding 70%. The economic mathematics now favored the defenders. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Hans Weber supervised V-1 launch operations from a converted quarry near Saint-Omer in northern France, watching with growing frustration as British defences destroyed his weapons with increasing regularity. During the first week of V-1 operations in June, approximately 60% of his launches had reached their targets. By late July, that success rate had collapsed to less than 10%. Most flying bombs never made it past the English coast, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire that seemed impossibly accurate. Weber's launch crews worked 18-hour shifts, trying to maintain firing rates that might saturate British defences through sheer volume, but proximity-fused ammunition had fundamentally altered the tactical equation. No matter how many V-1 the Germans launched, British gun batteries firing radar-equipped shells could engage each weapon with near-certain kill probability. The flying bombs that had seemed unstoppable during the opening days of the campaign were being methodically destroyed before they could threaten London. The psychological impact on German forces operating V-1 sites became increasingly apparent through intelligence reports compiled by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Decrypted messages from Luftwaffe units responsible for flying bomb operations revealed declining morale and questions about the continued viability of the V-1 offensive. Launch crews understood they were expending significant effort and resources to achieve minimal results. Colonel Max Wachtel, commanding the German 155th Flak Regiment responsible for V-1 operations, submitted increasingly pessimistic reports to Luftwaffe headquarters describing the effectiveness of British countermeasures. Enemy defensive fire has achieved near-total intercept capability, one decoded message revealed. V-1 operations against London are no longer achieving strategic objectives. Request evaluation of alternative deployment strategies or suspension of offensive until effective countermeasures can be developed. But Hitler personally insisted that V-1 attacks continue regardless of tactical effectiveness or economic cost. The vengeance weapons were as much about psychological warfare and political symbolism as military necessity. Suspending the offensive would acknowledge that British defences had defeated Germany's newest technology, undermining Nazi propaganda claims about German technical superiority and revenge for Allied bombing of German cities. The sustained V-1 campaign during late July and August 1944 demonstrated both the effectiveness of proximity fuses and the limits of strategic bombing using unmanned weapons. German forces launched over 6,000 flying bombs toward Britain between June 13th and August 31st. British defences destroyed over 4,000 before they reached populated areas. Fighter aircraft claimed approximately 1,000 kills. Anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuzzes accounted for nearly 3,000 destroyed V-2. The casualty statistics revealed the humanitarian impact of effective V-1 defences. During the first 2 weeks of attacks in June, when British defences relied primarily on conventional ammunition, flying bombs killed an average of 68 civilians per day. By late August, after proximity fuzzes had been widely deployed, V-1 attacks killed an average of 9 civilians per day, despite German forces maintaining similar launch rates. The proximity fuse had saved thousands of British lives while destroying German faith in their vengeance weapons' effectiveness. Major Raymond Lee, serving as American liaison officer to British Anti-Aircraft Command, compiled detailed technical reports on proximity fuse performance for transmission to the U.S. War Department. The data confirmed what American naval forces had discovered in the Pacific. Radar-equipped shells fundamentally altered the balance between offensive air attack and defensive fire. Lee's reports emphasized that proximity fuzzes were not simply more effective ammunition, but represented a qualitative transformation in defensive capabilities that rendered conventional tactical doctrines obsolete. The industrial achievement underlying Britain's V-1 defences was as remarkable as the tactical success. American factories were producing over 400,000 proximity fuses per month by summer 1944, enough to supply both Pacific naval operations and British anti-aircraft defences simultaneously. The manufacturing techniques developed for mass-producing precision electronic devices during wartime would enable the post-war electronics revolution, demonstrating how military necessity could drive industrial innovation with lasting civilian applications. The German response to proximity-fused ammunition proved largely ineffective, despite accurate intelligence assessments about British improvements. Luftwaffe technical experts correctly identified that British shells were using some form of radio proximity detection, but attempts to develop jamming countermeasures failed to account for the sophisticated discrimination circuits built into American fuses. The same electronic systems that allowed proximity fuses to distinguish between aircraft and ships in Pacific naval battles could differentiate between V-2 and ground-based radio transmitters, attempting to trigger premature detonation. By September 1944, the strategic situation had evolved to make continued V-1 operations from France increasingly difficult. Allied ground forces advancing from Normandy were overrunning launch sites across Pas-de-Calais and northern France. German forces retreating toward the Rhine had neither the time nor resources to relocate V-1 production and launch facilities. The flying bomb offensive that had seemed capable of breaking British civilian morale just 3 months earlier was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied ground advances and devastatingly effective air defences. The final weeks of V-1 operations from French launch sites demonstrated the complete reversal of tactical advantage that proximity fuses had created. German forces launched their last flying bombs from Pas-de-Calais on September 1, 1944. Of the 23 V-2 fired that day, British defences destroyed 22 before they reached populated areas. One flying bomb impacted a rural area of Kent, killing a dairy cow and damaging a barn. It represented the last V-1 casualty from French-launched weapons, ending the most intense phase of Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign. The liberation of V-1 launch sites by Canadian and British forces advancing through northern France provided Allied intelligence with comprehensive technical data about German flying bomb operations. Engineers examined the simple launch ramps, pulse jet engines, and mechanical autopilots that had terrorized London for 3 months. The technology was crude but effective when used against defences lacking proximity-fused ammunition. Against radar-equipped shells, the V-1's predictable flight characteristics and vulnerable structure made it an ideal target for the very weapons it was supposed to overwhelm through numbers. General Pyle's final assessment of anti-aircraft operations against V-2 provided quantitative evidence of proximity fuse effectiveness. Between June 28, when proximity-fused ammunition first entered service, and September 1, when French launch sites were overrun, British gun batteries had fired approximately 100,000 proximity-fused shells. They had destroyed approximately 3,000 V-1 flying bombs. Each kill required an average of 33 rounds, compared to over 130 rounds per kill using conventional mechanical time fuzzes. The improvement in ammunition efficiency was matched by dramatic reductions in civilian casualties. Proximity fuses had saved an estimated 4,000 British lives by preventing V-2 from reaching their intended targets. The economic benefit was equally significant. Destroying V-2 over unpopulated countryside prevented damage to factories, transportation infrastructure, and housing that would have required substantial reconstruction resources. The story of proximity fuzzes and V-1 defences did not end with the liberation of French launch sites in September 1944. German engineers had anticipated the eventual loss of Pas-de-Calais positions and developed alternative deployment methods that would extend the vengeance weapon campaign into 1945. The flying bomb that Londoners had learned to track by its distinctive pulse jet engine would return, launched from new positions that British defences had not prepared to counter. On September 8, 1944, just 1 week after the last V-1 crossed the English Channel from France, a Heinkel He-111 bomber climbed to 10,000 feet over the North Sea. Suspended beneath the aircraft's fuselage hung a V-1 flying bomb modified for air launch operations. The pilot released the weapon 20 miles from the British coast. The pulse jet engine ignited. The mechanical autopilot oriented toward London. A new phase of the Vengeance weapon campaign had begun. Air-launched V-2 presented tactical challenges that differed substantially from ground-launched weapons. The flying bombs approached from multiple directions depending on where Luftwaffe bombers could penetrate British air defence zones. They could be released at varying altitudes, making interception by fighter aircraft more difficult. The launch aircraft remained beyond the range of British coastal gun batteries, safely outside the diver strip that had proven so effective against V-2 approaching from France. Air Marshal Hill recognized immediately that his carefully organized coastal defense system would be less effective against V-2 approaching from arbitrary directions over the North Sea. The diver strip had concentrated maximum firepower along predictable approach routes from Pas-de-Calais. Air-launched weapons could bypass these defences entirely, requiring a return to distributed anti-aircraft positions around London that had proven less effective during the initial campaign. The first week of air-launched V-1 operations revealed both the continued effectiveness of proximity fuses and the operational limitations imposed by dispersed defensive positions. German bombers launched 63 flying bombs during early September. British fighters destroyed 18 before they reached the coast. Anti-aircraft batteries equipped with proximity-fused ammunition engaged 42 V-2 and destroyed 31. 14 flying bombs reached the London area, killing 94 civilians and causing substantial property damage. The casualty rate was significantly higher than the final weeks of ground-launched V-1 operations, but still dramatically lower than the early days of the campaign before proximity fuses became available. General Pyle calculated that without radar-equipped ammunition, air-launched V-2 would have achieved success rates similar to the initial June attacks, potentially killing hundreds of Londoners per week. The proximity fuse remained Britain's most effective defence against Hitler's vengeance weapons, even when tactical circumstances changed. Luftwaffe operational planning for air-launched V-2 reflected German understanding that British defences had achieved near-total interception capability against flying bombs following predictable trajectories. The new deployment strategy emphasised surprise and dispersion. Launch aircraft approached from multiple directions, released weapons at varying altitudes, and attempted to saturate defences through coordinated attacks that forced British gun batteries to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Captain Ernst Bauer piloted one of the Heinkel bombers assigned to V-1 air launch operations from airfields in Holland. His mission briefings emphasized the extreme danger of approaching British airspace, where RAF night fighters patrolled with radar-guided interception capabilities. The He-111 was slow, vulnerable, and loaded with a weapon that would destroy the aircraft if damaged before release. Bauer's survival depended on approaching the launch point under cover of darkness, releasing the V-1 quickly, and escaping before British fighters could intercept. The operational reality proved as dangerous as briefings suggested. RAF Mosquito night fighters equipped with AI Mark X radar could detect German bombers at ranges exceeding 10 miles. Once detected, the Heinkel stood little chance of escaping the faster, more manoeuvrable British aircraft. Bauer's squadron lost 4 aircraft during the first 2 weeks of air-launched V-1 operations. The crews were experienced bomber pilots who had survived years of combat over Britain and the Eastern Front, now being sacrificed to deliver weapons that British defences destroyed with routine efficiency. German casualties from air-launched V-1 operations began exceeding British civilian casualties caused by the flying bombs themselves. The tactical equation had shifted to favour defenders so completely that continued offensive operations served primarily to waste German resources without achieving significant military objectives. But Hitler's insistence on maintaining vengeance weapon attacks regardless of cost meant that Luftwaffe crews continued flying missions that accomplished little except their own destruction. British technical intelligence teams analysing the air-launched V-1 threat concluded that proximity fuses remained effective regardless of the weapon's approach vector or release altitude. The radar-equipped shells detected flying bombs and detonated at optimal range, whether the V-1 was launched from a ground ramp in France or dropped from an aircraft over the North Sea. The fundamental physics of proximity detection created defensive advantages that tactical modifications could not overcome. The winter of 1944 brought a final German attempt to overwhelm British defences through technological escalation rather than tactical innovation. On November 10th, a new sound interrupted London's evening quiet. Not the familiar pulse jet engine of V-1 flying bombs, but the sharp crack of a supersonic shockwave followed by a massive explosion in Chiswick. The V-2 ballistic missile, Hitler's second vengeance weapon, had arrived. The V-2 represented a quantum leap in military technology compared to the V-1. Standing 46 feet tall and powered by liquid fuel rockets, the missile climbed to altitudes exceeding 60 miles before descending on its target at speeds over 3,000 miles per hour. There was no warning, no distinctive engine sound, no possibility of interception by fighters or anti-aircraft guns. The weapon simply arrived, travelling faster than sound, its impact heard before the sound of its approach reached human ears. Against V-2 seconds, proximity fuses were useless. The missiles travelled too fast and too high for any anti-aircraft weapon system to engage. British defences that had achieved such remarkable success against V-1 flying bombs could do nothing to stop ballistic missiles that fell from the edge of space. The only effective countermeasure was to destroy V-2 launch sites through bombing raids or ground advances, neither of which proximity-fused ammunition could facilitate. But the continued threat from air-launched Vohn's second meant that proximity fuses remained critical to London's defence, even as ballistic missiles added a new dimension to the vengeance weapon campaign. Throughout the winter of 1944 and early spring of 1945, British gun batteries continued engaging flying bombs with radar-equipped shells, while V-2 seconds fell without warning or defence. The dual threat created a surreal tactical environment where one weapon could be stopped reliably, while another arrived with complete impunity. The final statistics for air-launched V-1 operations revealed the sustained effectiveness of proximity-fused ammunition despite changed tactical circumstances. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Luftwaffe bombers launched approximately 1,200 flying bombs from aircraft over the North Sea. British defences destroyed over 800 before they reached populated areas. The success rate was lower than the 80+% achieved during the final weeks of ground-launched V-1 operations, but still represented a dramatic improvement over conventional anti-aircraft capabilities. Squadron leader Thomas Pinkerton compiled operational data on proximity fuse performance for the RAF's Operational Research Section, analysing thousands of engagement records from gun batteries defending against both ground-launched and air-launched Vohn's second. His statistical analysis confirmed what frontline gunners had observed through direct experience. Radar-equipped shells achieved consistent kill rates, exceeding 70%, regardless of tactical variables like approach direction, altitude, or weather conditions. The physics of proximity detection created fundamental advantages that tactical modifications could not overcome. A V-1 flying within 70 feet of a proximity-fused shell would trigger detonation, whether it approached from France or from the North Sea, whether it flew at 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet, whether visibility was clear or obscured by clouds. The shells detected targets through radio waves that penetrated atmospheric conditions invisible to human observation. German technical intelligence made one final attempt to develop countermeasures against proximity-fused ammunition during the closing months of the war. Engineers at Luftwaffe research facilities in Bavaria experimented with coating V-1 airframes with radar-absorbing materials similar to those being tested for submarine applications. The theory was that reducing the flying bomb's radar cross-section might prevent proximity fuses from detecting targets at sufficient range to trigger detonation. The experimental V-2 with radar-absorbing coatings were never deployed operationally. Allied ground forces overran German research facilities before the modifications could be tested under combat conditions. Post-war analysis of captured prototypes revealed that the radar-absorbing materials reduced detection range by approximately 15%, insufficient to prevent proximity fuses from engaging targets effectively. The fundamental electromagnetic principles underlying radar detection created defensive advantages that material modifications could not neutralize. The last V-1 flying bomb to threaten Britain was launched on March 29, 1945. A Luftwaffe bomber released the weapon over the North Sea in early morning darkness. British radar detected the characteristic signature of a pulse jet engine approaching the coast near Diss in Norfolk. Gun batteries tracked the incoming weapon and engaged with proximity-fused ammunition at a range of 6,000 yards. The first shell detonated 40 feet from the V-1's starboard wing, shrapnel severing control cables and puncturing the fuel tank. The flying bomb cartwheeled through the sky, trailing fire, and impacted in an unpopulated field, its warhead detonating among winter wheat that would never be harvested. The explosion crater measured 20 feet across and 8 feet deep, silent testament to what would have happened if the weapon had reached its intended target. That final V-1 represented the number 8,524 launched against Britain since June 13, 1944. British defences had destroyed over 6,000 before they reached populated areas. Proximity fused. Ammunition accounted for approximately 4,000 of those kills, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus of Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign. The human cost of the V-1 offensive provided stark evidence of proximity, fuse effectiveness. During the first 2 weeks of attacks in June 1944, before proximity-fused ammunition entered widespread service, V-2 killed an average of 68 civilians per day. During the final months of the campaign, when proximity fuses equipped most anti-aircraft batteries, daily casualties averaged 12. The improvement represented thousands of lives saved by shells that could think for themselves. Dr. Merle Tuve received detailed reports on proximity fuse performance against V-2 at his laboratories in Baltimore, watching with satisfaction as the technology his team had developed achieved results that vindicated years of research and development. The miniature radar transmitters that had been designed to protect American ships from Japanese aircraft were now defending London from Hitler's robot bombs. The versatility of proximity detection across different tactical scenarios demonstrated that fundamental innovations in physics created military advantages that transcended specific operational contexts. The economic analysis of proximity fuse effectiveness against V-2 revealed cost-benefit ratios that impressed even skeptical military planners focused on resource efficiency. Each proximity-fused shell cost approximately $18 to manufacture. Each V-1 flying bomb cost approximately $5,000, including launch equipment and fuel. British gun batteries, firing 33 rounds per kill, were expending roughly $600 in ammunition to destroy targets worth $2,500, not including the value of civilian lives saved and property damage prevented. The German V-1 program represented enormous industrial investment that failed to achieve strategic objectives because British defences, equipped with American proximity fuzzes, could destroy flying bombs faster than German factories could produce them. The technological superiority that proximity detection provided created unsustainable exchange ratios that doomed the vengeance weapon campaign to failure regardless of how many V-1 German industry manufactured. The liberation of German research facilities by Allied ground forces during April and May 1945 provided comprehensive intelligence about Nazi attempts to develop countermeasures against proximity-fused ammunition. Captured documents revealed that German scientists had correctly identified the basic principles of radio proximity detection, but lacked the miniaturization techniques required to create similar weapons. German vacuum tube technology in 1944 lagged approximately 2 years behind American capabilities, making it impossible to replicate the subminiature tubes that enabled proximity fuses to survive. Artillery firing stresses. The V-1 campaign's conclusion coincided with Germany's final collapse in May 1945. The last flying bombs launched against Britain during late March represented the final gasp of Hitler's vengeance weapon strategy. German industrial capacity had been devastated by Allied bombing. Launch sites in Holland and Germany were being overrun by advancing armies. The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient fuel to sustain air-launched operations. Most critically, British defences equipped with proximity-fused ammunition had achieved such consistent effectiveness that continued V-1 attacks accomplished nothing except wasting resources that might have been deployed for conventional defence. General Pyle's final assessment of anti-aircraft command operations against V-2 emphasised the transformational impact of proximity fuses on defensive warfare. The radar-equipped shells had not simply improved anti-aircraft effectiveness incrementally, they had fundamentally altered the balance between offensive air attack and defensive fire, creating conditions where small, fast-moving targets could be destroyed reliably before reaching their objectives. Air Marshal Hill's post-war analysis noted that proximity fuses had saved Britain from potentially catastrophic casualties while validating the scientific innovation that American researchers had pioneered during the desperate days after Pearl Harbor. The technology that Dr. Fuze and his team had developed to protect American ships in the Pacific had proven equally effective, defending London from Hitler's vengeance weapons, demonstrating the universal applicability of radar proximity detection across different tactical scenarios. The legacy of proximity fuses extended far beyond their tactical success against V-1 flying bombs. The manufacturing techniques developed for mass-producing precision electronics during wartime enabled the post-war consumer electronics revolution. The miniature vacuum tubes, designed to survive artillery firing stresses, became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated electronic devices that transformed civilian life during the 1950s and 60s. Military applications of proximity detection evolved rapidly during the Cold War, as American and Soviet forces developed increasingly sophisticated guided missiles and air defense systems. The basic principle that Fuze's team had pioneered, using radio waves to detect targets and trigger weapons, automatically became fundamental to virtually every air defense system deployed during the latter half of the 20th century. The lessons learned from proximity fuse operations against V-2 influenced military doctrine for generations. The effectiveness of automated target detection over human calculation demonstrated that properly designed electronic systems could outperform even highly trained operators under combat conditions. The shift from mechanical to electronic fire control systems accelerated across all military services, driven by empirical evidence that radar-equipped weapons achieved consistently superior results. The human dimension of proximity fuse success remained visible in the survival rates of London civilians who lived through the V-1 campaign. Neighbourhoods that would have suffered devastating casualties from flying bomb attacks experienced dramatically reduced losses because anti-aircraft batteries could destroy weapons before they reached populated areas. The technology saved thousands of lives while demonstrating that scientific innovation, properly funded and intelligently applied, could tip the balance of warfare in favour of defenders. Joan Curran's window technology and Merle Fuze's proximity fuse represented complementary approaches to electronic warfare that emerged from similar recognition that conventional defenses were failing against modern air attack. Curran had blinded enemy radar to protect attacking aircraft. Fuze had created radar-equipped ammunition to destroy attacking aircraft. Together, these innovations established the foundations of electronic warfare that would define military operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The V-1 flying bomb, which had seemed unstoppable during the terrifying early weeks of June 1944, ended its operational life as evidence that technological innovation could overcome numerical superiority and strategic surprise. Hitler's vengeance weapons had been defeated not through superior numbers or better tactics, but through American electronics that gave defensive systems decisive advantages over offensive weapons. The final accounting of the V-1 campaign revealed statistics that validated every aspect of proximity, fuse, development, and deployment. British anti-aircraft batteries had fired approximately 120,000 proximity-fused shells between June 1944 and March 1945. They had destroyed approximately 4,000 V-1 flying bombs. The ammunition efficiency achieved through radar proximity detection represented a six-fold improvement over conventional mechanical time, fuses, saving both lives and resources while demonstrating that sometimes the most powerful weapons are those that can think for themselves. Dr. Fuze's reflection on proximity, Fuze success against V-1 second, captured the essence of scientific innovation applied to military necessity. We created shells that could detect targets more accurately than human gunners could calculate trajectories, Fuze observed in a classified post-war report. The V-1 campaign proved that automation and electronics could solve tactical problems that conventional approaches could not address effectively. The lessons learned defending London influenced every subsequent development in air defense technology. The proximity fuse's journey from desperate improvisation after Pearl Harbor to decisive weapon against Hitler's vengeance bombs demonstrated how rapidly military technology could evolve under wartime pressure. In less than 3 years, American scientists and engineers had transformed an impossible concept into mass-produced ammunition that fundamentally altered the nature of defensive warfare. The miniature radar sets packed inside artillery shells represented innovation at its most consequential, saving thousands of lives while establishing principles that would guide military electronics development for generations. The empty sky over London during spring 1945, free from the pulse jet engines that had terrorized the city for 10 months, stood as testament to what American ingenuity and British determination had achieved. The V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's vengeance weapon designed to break British civilian morale, had been defeated by shells that could detect their targets through radio waves and detonate at precisely the right moment. The technology that had begun as a farm boy's question about making shells think for themselves had saved a city from rocket terror and proved that sometimes the most sophisticated weapons are defeated by even more sophisticated defenses. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.